Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about looking for legal jobs in a slowing economy. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about looking for legal jobs in a slowing economy. Welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Well, the current economy for legal employment seems a little bit weird, no? I mean, the overall news keeps talking about what a hot job market we have, where employees are in this power position. But we're actually seeing legal news starting to report that law firm hiring is slowing down, or sometimes even that layoffs are happening. What do you think is going on here?
Well, I think that some of it is sort of lessons learned from previous downturns, most recently in the 2008 financial crisis. And I think that probably law firms are just trying to be a little bit conservative in their hiring. They're not really sure what's happening with the economy. I think no one's really sure, are we going into a recession? Are we close to a recession? Are we going to get around it? So I think they're just being a little bit cautious without trying to make drastic changes like layoffs or total hiring freezes. I get the sort of impression they're just trying to be like a little bit more discerning with their hiring and maybe slow it down so they can wait and see what happens. And I think that's probably good for everybody, like long term.
Right. And you mentioned 2008. I mean, do you think this is 2008 all over again, where we're going to see firms just slashing their classes and laying people off and all that kind of stuff?
I mean, I do not have a crystal ball, but I think it's really unlikely that it's that scenario. That was sort of a perfect storm of so many things coming together all at once to create this sort of nightmare scenario that hit like very fast and like huge and kind of different than anything that had ever happened before, particularly to law firms. And I think there were a lot of lessons that came out of that. I think law firms don't want to be in that position anymore. I think firms are way less leveraged than they were before, some of the ones that actually went out of business. And I think in terms of hiring, they did kind of take a more cautious approach, since then. I don't think it's ever really gotten to like the boom time of right before then.
Right when I graduated.
Yeah, unfortunately. Because I think the people at that time, and you can say with your class, they thought, things will always be great. Like this
right.
is...
No, I mean, the classes were huge. They were like throwing enormous parties like all the time. I mean, it was definitely a little over the top.
Yeah, I've heard some really crazy stories of that time, particularly in New York and, big cities. And it was sort of like, if you overshoot your class, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Hire whoever you can get, just like load it up. We'll find a spot for you. And I think those times are over, and that's a good thing because, they just weren't planning very well for the future. And like, now I think they think more, they look at sort of statistics of like, how many people do we expect to still be here in 2 years and 3 years and 4 years? And what do we sort of, project our business is going to look like? And, which practice groups are doing well and, continue to do well, that kind of thing. So I think this is not 2008 because we learned a lot of lessons from them. And also it doesn't really seem like the economy is going to hit like that did, where just like a sudden crash. I think this is more like a typical sort of like, a smaller recession or a smaller dip, which, there's been lots of those over the last like 20 or 30 years that law firms have always, weathered and done okay and just come out of it.
Right. I mean, and we saw even something a little similar when COVID hit and the economy kind of tanked and popped back, and everyone's like, are they going to stop hiring? Are they going to, and then like the summer programs really were an issue because it's like, how do you even do a summer program in a pandemic?
And I think it's actually pretty impressive that everyone did sort of figure it out. Because who would have ever predicted like planning for that? And okay, life is going to go virtual. And, if you'd asked right before then, how is this going to work? I would have thought it's not going to work.
Right.
And, how is this going to go forward? But I think, people find a way to adjust. And like you said, I think it did bounce back quicker than everyone expected. And that's kind of a good thing. Because I think, there was time to sort of figure it out. So I just get the feeling they're sort of putting a little bit of the brakes on things right now.
Right. Just at least not accelerating and
Yeah.
coasting or braking a little bit. I mean, and some of this, I think people, if they haven't worked at a firm, may not really understand what fuels a lot of the big law work. I mean, it's things like mergers and acquisitions, which we know are slowing down. It's big lawsuits, which tend to often involve tech companies, which we know are like having their own issues. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think this is definitely something to think about in terms of what areas you're interested in, as a law student. And this is also some of the lessons that I think students learned from 2008 or other downturns, which is like, bankruptcy is really big. I know a bunch of people that ended up doing bankruptcy work that had never expected to do that, but maybe they were interested in corporate and M&A and that wasn't happening, so they decided to pick another area. Or like labor and employment is really big when companies have to, make hard decisions about, what they're going to do with their employees. They have to bring in law firms, so that can, do well in this kind of time. And I agree. I think the tech companies seem like the ones who are going to get hit hardest. And so, sort of the Silicon Valley boom time is probably, over or taking a break for a while. So if that was an area you were thinking about, I would say to myself, now might not be the time for that. And maybe I should think about other things that, would do okay in an environment where there aren't like huge deals happening and money isn't just getting thrown around so easily like it was before. So you kind of have to be strategic about what areas are, going to continue. And same on the litigation side, I think, people are more likely to settle things and not have them go to trial or get bigger if they feel like money is an issue.
Right. So I think this might not be the time to go into your interviews demanding that you work only on IPOs and things like that.
Yeah, you want to be smart about that you understand what's going on, because that's going to make you look like you don't have a concept of like the world we're living in and like, right, what's going to get affected.
Yeah, I mean, I read an article the other day that like Goldman is planning to resume their layoffs that they used to do, yearly when they stopped for the pandemic. And when things like that happen, Big Law definitely pays attention because that's where a lot of their money comes from, is these huge financial corporations.
And I would keep an eye on, it's very easy to find out certain firms rely on certain companies or banks like for a good amount of their business. Like Goldman Sachs uses certain law firms to do a lot of their work. And so, keep that in mind. You can see like who's feeding who, or Google. And a lot of these companies, the bigger ones, they do use, multiple law firms. But sometimes you can find out, okay, this is like a major contributor. So anything that happens at Goldman Sachs is going to affect this law firm.
Right.
So keep that in mind when you're like, what group you want to be in, what firm you want to be at. If you know their biggest clients and you know what's happening, that could affect it.
Definitely. Well, for students who are interested in big law work, how concerned do you think they should be right now?
I mean, I don't think you should be panicking. And I wouldn't tell anyone to ever panic about this. I think there's always, a solution, and there's always like an alternative or a different strategy. But I think that you should be cautious, and I think you should be careful not to like box yourself in too specifically to this is exactly what I want, or be too demanding, or just assume that things are going to work out. even if you're at a good school and even if you're, like doing well there and you're someone who, you expected to get a job really easily, I still think you should be cautious and you're not really sure what's going to happen down the line. So I would just be smart about, like where you're going to work and what type of work you're interested in and being really flexible. If like the area you were interested in, is something that's going to really die down, then you need to be a team player and make it clear that like you're ready to do whatever's busy. That would be my advice if that's the direction you're going, that you want big law. You need to make it clear that you'll go with what they need.
Right. I think that's good advice. What other things can students do to kind of position themselves for either like that summer associate position or the job offer if they are going to be a summer, maybe like the next summer in this economy or really any economy?
Well, obviously, like I just said, being at, a good school and having good grades is always going to come first, And so if they have a limited pool, they're going to try to take, sort of the top students, and they're probably going to have less flexibility than they might have at other times. So I would definitely be realistic. Like you shouldn't be focused just on your reaches. Or, if you want big law, it may not happen now. If you're somewhere in the middle of the class and it's something where they've cut their summer class in half, you're probably, not gonna make the cut. I think there's things you can do to position yourself better. I always suggest that people are really relying on their network and really making an effort to try to get to know people and really put their best foot forward in terms of like outreach and making relationships, because I think that makes the biggest difference, especially if, your grades aren't the top. And so you might not be an obvious choice, but having somebody inside who knows you or likes you, is always going to be good. So, I think that's something you can do. Obviously, you want to make sure all your materials are really polished and you have a good story, and if your grades are not the top, that you're putting forward all of your best qualities, that can do some work to offset your grades. Because basically, people are just going to be more picky in an environment where, they have the ability to be more picky because they're taking smaller classes and there'll be less jobs available. So I would think about that. And then I would just be really realistic in terms of where you're applying and make sure you're applying to places that seem within reach, even if they wouldn't have been like your dream job.
Right. And I think also just being on top of all of these things, making sure that you're responding promptly to invitations to interview and to schedule a callback and things like that. Like, you don't want to be that person who they're like, wait, we haven't heard from them for a week. Like, do they want to do this or not? Like, you want to be that person who's like, yes, I'd love to do it. Like, let's get that on the calendar as soon as possible.
I agree. And I think I've noticed that some students may be caught up with this, like you said, the news stories of there's so many jobs and, it's all about the employees and what they want. And I think the tide might be turning without some students realizing it. And so they may be kind of coming at it from the attitude of like, oh, I can wait and see. And, I'll schedule this one, after I've, done something I already had planned, or, I'll see what happens with my top choice before even getting back to my third choice. And I would say that's not the approach. I wouldn't really be like that in any economy. I think you should always be somebody who makes it really clear that you want the job. It's always better to have. Yeah, exactly. You have to at least make it seem like it's a top choice for you. So there's no world in which it's not better to get your interview in earlier. Like that's always the ideal. Because, people may be accepting job offers quicker and there might be less opportunities later, is what I think sort of happens. And so there might be people who are sort of on hold. And then if all the early people accept, you're, kind of going to be left behind. So basically, I would just, be a go-getter, make sure that you're, just showing your interest and not kind of laying back at all and just assuming it'll come to you, because I don't think that's the economy we're in right now.
Right. I agree with that. I think you've got to make it clear that, like, even if you are not being 100% truthful about it, that this is a job you're enthusiastic about, you would love to have, you make them think you will accept it probably if they offer it to you. And then you can make your mind up later.
And like I think we've said before, this is your first job. This doesn't have to be the dream, ideal job, so if you end up not at the one you really wanted, it doesn't mean you can't end up later at the one you really wanted. It just means that I think it's good to have like a secure job set. And so it may mean like taking something sooner that isn't the perfect one.
Right. And generally speaking, they are like guidelines around, they have to give you, some amount of time to accept. You're not expected to accept on the spot or anything like that. So, and if you do have one offer, then maybe you can leverage that with another firm that you're very interested in, that you've already interviewed with, and say, hey, I have this other offer. I just wanted to like see where you guys are at in the process. Understand, if you can't get back to me, but if you can, I would really appreciate it. And then that might motivate them to actually make an offer.
Definitely. I mean, I think it's like anything. Once you're wanted by somewhere else,
exactly.
Once you're in demand, more interesting.
Yeah, everyone's like, "Oh, wait, you might turn us down. Like maybe we should offer you something too." Let me get back to you on that.
Yeah, I have noticed that happen. I totally agree. And my philosophy is like, as long as you would work there, it's not somewhere that you would never work. You should want to get an offer from everywhere. Like, there's no reason you wouldn't want to try to get an offer.
Yeah, you may as well. I mean, it's always more fun to turn them down than vice versa.
Yeah, and you're kind of in the driver's seat once you have an offer. You can, ask more of the questions you really want to know and, find out more about it. So, you should really want to be getting as many offers as you can right now.
Right. And also, you shouldn't have applied to these places if you didn't want to work there. So something to think about when you're applying. Don't just apply willy-nilly. Apply to places you think you might actually want to work.
Because you also don't want to take someone else's spot. And that's the thing about keeping offers open. I always say, too, like, be a good person. So it's fine to keep it open if you are really considering it, you're waiting to hear back from someone, or you might take that one. But if you have another offer that you would take over, one that you have and that you're holding open, like there's no need for that. You can let it go.
Yeah, you don't need to collect like 10 just so you can be like, oh, I have 10 offers open on the table when you're like 5 of those you definitely would not take.
Because in a tight economy, there's limited spots and you want to make sure you're being good to your classmates,
Yeah, exactly. And just generally a good human being.
Mm-hmm.
Well, do you think people need to be looking more carefully at which firms to accept for the summer? And if so, what should they really be looking at here?
I would say a little bit. I think you should always be looking carefully at like how the firm's doing. I would say that in any economy. And there are kind of ways to find out, like even on Above the Law or, other sort of blogs. Like usually there are rumors, or you can find out about, sometimes people do layoffs in a sort of stealth way. So all of that, could be a concern. Or just if there's kind of like talk. And like I said, if they, work with a company, they get a lot of business from them that's, doing really poorly or sort of in flux, I think that's something to think about. But I would say that I think there aren't law firms really in the position, or not like it was in 2008, where, there were quite a few that completely went under, and, there were summer classes that didn't have, jobs, like hundreds of people, per firm that didn't have anywhere to go. So I don't think that's probably going to happen this time around, but I still think you want to, look for any signs that there's trouble for sure.
Right. And I think you can find a lot of this often, like, using your legal research skills to do some research on our good friend Google. A lot of this stuff is kind of floating around if you really look for it. So I think just being a little skeptical and a little cautious, I guess I would say. Not paranoid, but just a little cautious.
Sometimes you'll hear there's like a bunch of people who are saying they want to leave a place or something like that. Is always a sign that there's something going on.
Right. Or like whole practice groups suddenly start transferring out of one place. And you're like, that's weird. Like, is that a sinking ship?
Exactly. You just kind of, I've noticed everyone sort of gets the feeling something is trending wrong. So.
Right. But yeah, I mean, I think you have to pay attention a little bit and not just sort of be like, oh, well, I'm sure they'll all be fine, because they're not necessarily all fine all the time. So I think just keeping up with kind of the legal press and things like that, because, a lot of this is written about. And, I think you just need to be aware of kind of what you're signing up for.
And also, you shouldn't just say, oh, they're a big name, they're fine. Right. Because I think that's something else we learned from 2008, like places that no one in a million years would have thought would be gone the next day were.
Yeah.
Places that have been around for over 100 years.
Like in days.
Yeah. So you want to just make sure you're not just writing it off because like, oh, they're a good firm. I've heard of them.
Right. I've heard of them. They're on a list that I read about something that they were here for, a long time. Is because, people do screw things up. They get overextended. Like maybe a big client goes under, doesn't pay them for whatever reason. Things happen.
Absolutely.
And as soon as they do happen, everybody else wants to jump ship. So that it can, I think I heard it in the last recession or something, it's a hard business when all of your assets walk out the door every day.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a really good point.
They can walk somewhere else like pretty easily just across the street and like go work for someone else. So yeah, it turned out some of those places really were houses of cards that collapsed really quickly.
And so you just don't want to be on the tail end of that where everyone else has done that and you're still like, what's going on?
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully that doesn't happen to anyone. But, just be aware. And you mentioned earlier, being a little more flexible on like your desired practice area. If somebody goes in and they're like, I only want to be in New York, I only want to do M&A, what do you think the reaction is going to be to that?
Probably not good in this particular situation. There are times where you have your pick, or, something like M&A is so big, they just need so many people, you'd never have a problem. But I think going in with that attitude right now is just kind of missing the point of, being aware of what's going on and where the economy's headed and what's sort of happening and just how in flux I think everything is. It's not necessarily that we know, what's going to turn out or if we're going to end up in a recession, but we know that we're not really sure and that things don't feel very stable. So I would say like somebody going in with that attitude probably isn't going to be received well because they're going to think, well, what if we don't have that? Then they're just not going to work or we're going to have to get rid of them. So I think you can go in, I'm really interested in this. This is what I've been planning to do, but I am flexible. Like, I know I want to do transactional work, but I would be open to real estate or bankruptcy or something else, Like, I think you can probably still say whether you're interested in like litigation or transactional, but I just would not be that specific. Or you may have to say to yourself, like, I'm not going to be able to do this right now.
Right.
It may be the wrong time for you if that's the only thing you want to do.
Well, I think, to be honest, it also sounds a little ridiculous for most people who don't really have a serious background in this to come in and be like, I must be doing this one exact thing. It's like, well, okay, you don't really have anything to bring to the table. Maybe if you were a consultant or something. But even
then, I think like there's other things you could do, that might be doing better right now. So I totally agree. There's a few people that do have real specialties going into law school, but there's few and far between. And I think like you need to have flexibility when you're starting as a first year, sort of at the bottom of the food chain.
Right.
I think you want to think about that.
Also the reality is like ex-I bankers are a dime a dozen at top schools. So like the fact that you did your 2 years like wherever doesn't really put you in like a special category.
And that's a good thing to think about. I think some people sort of overestimate, how it looks and how important they are. And, there's almost no first year that's that important that has something that makes them so unique that, anyone really cares. And I know lots of people during other recessions that ended up practicing in the opposite area that they expected to, and they're fine. Like they had a good career and it's fine and it worked out. And some of them got to switch back at some point. But I do think you need to be flexible or be prepared for it not working out.
Yeah, and I think it's a balance because on the one hand, you don't want to go in and be like, well, I have no idea what I want to do. I'll do anything you want me to do. Like, it's good to have some, and they're like, well, okay, you don't know if you want to do like corporate work or litigation. Like, do you know anything? And it's fine to be like, I want to explore both areas. Like, I have interest in both. But to say like, oh, I have no idea what I want to do just kind of makes it seem like you have no idea what you want to do with your life.
I totally agree. You need to go in with some kind of story.
Yeah.
Of like different things you want to try. It doesn't have to be one thing,
Right.
but you need something that makes sort of sense that you are in law school and know something about what it'll be like to practice law. So I think there is a balance between being flexible and then also having interests.
Right. You could say, like, I really enjoyed my civil procedure class and I did well in it. So I'm interested in exploring litigation. But I'm also interested in, maybe taking on a corporate assignment or two just to experience that. I think, people don't have a problem with that. It's just like, I don't know what I want to do is not a great answer.
Yeah, I think both sides of that coin are not great. It's not like I only want to work on the biggest deals.
Right.
That's not going to really work either. So yeah, I would say be flexible. And if you want to do litigation, like everyone has general litigation where you will get to do lots of different things. So that always fits.
Right. Yeah. And, again, like if you go in, I had a tech background, so I didn't at the time because it didn't really occur to me I might want to do this. I could have said like, well, I'd like to do patent work, which is what I ended up doing after I graduated. But, to go in and insist that like I had to do that would just be a little weird.
Right. And I definitely see students kind of on both sides. So I would say, just you can think about, or you can do some research about, what areas of law sort of do better or worse in a, economic downturn. I think it's pretty easy to find that out.
Yeah, it's not like rocket science, most of it.
Yeah.
Bankruptcy said an uptick.
Yeah, I think you could just think about it for 5 minutes and come up with some stuff.
Yeah, and then there's some things that are, fairly stable that, aren't really kind of the bread and butter necessarily of big law, but they might be there. Things like if they do like estate planning and things like that sort of stuff is very stable typically throughout different economies.
I was going to say that. And, if they're working with really high net worth people, like they still need their money dealt with, even if they have a little bit less.
Tax is another one, like probably still popular.
Yeah, I think those are kind of never going to be the biggest money makers, but they're going to be stable. And I actually think labor employment falls in that category too. It's usually one that like doesn't make as much money, but is always has work.
Right. Yeah. So if you have any interest in those topics, this might be a good time to bring those up if the firm actually does that type of work, of course.
But research it and make sure you know what you're talking about.
Yeah. You don't want to go and tell them like you really want to do employment law when they don't have an employment law practice. Not going to look great.
Exactly.
All right, well, before we wrap up, if this first big law job unfortunately doesn't pan out, is all lost here?
Never.
I knew you were going to say that.
Never. I think you never give up.
You're such an optimist.
Yeah. Well, people will ask me at all different times in the, process, even when we're getting really close to like the summer when you would have needed a job, like, should I just give up? And it's like, no, you don't give up till the summer's over. Like, even if it's June, maybe you can still find something for a month to do. And that obviously doesn't happen very often, but basically, like, it's never over. You can always, still be looking for things and still have a plan. And especially for your legal career, I would say it is good to be realistic. Like, if you're not someone where big law is probably going to work for your first job, which means, your grades aren't very good, or you're at a lower ranked school, you're someone that they're just going to maybe pass over. I think it's better to think long term about how you would get there rather than waste a lot of resources on trying to get that summer associate job that you're not going to get.
Right.
So the smarter move to me would be like, can I get a mid-level job in an area where I could, become an expert or, learn a lot, still get good experience and be able to get in as a lateral, I think is smarter. Or there's lots of government job ways to get in, to big law if you're at, public defender office or prosecutor, and those jobs are competitive as well. But maybe there's a chance you can get one of those. So I think there's lots of ins long-term to get to big law, and it basically matters less where you went to school and what your grades were as you get more experience. And that kind of replaces, some of the emphasis on grades in school. So, that would be my advice, is like, why waste a lot of effort on something that is most likely not going to work out, rather than try to find like the best next thing that, like, for job 2 or 3 or 4 might lead you back to Big Law. And also network and get to know people, especially if there's a practice group you're interested in. I know so many people that got jobs because they knew people in specific practice groups who ended up recruiting them in, from smaller firms or not as prestigious places. So all of that stuff matters. And to me, this like is the long game. There's a lot of people who do Big Law for a few years and leave. So you can go the other way.
Right.
You can do something else for a few years and come in.
You can fill that gap.
Yeah, I really think that. But I do think that it takes some sort of creative thinking and forethought and strategizing, rather than just sort of like trying to let something happen to you. Like, that's not how that kind of career is going to go.
Yeah, definitely not. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Any final thoughts you have on this topic?
I'm still optimistic. And I think we've seen much worse times, at least in my law firm career. And so to me, this is just kind of a blip. And so we should adjust for it. But I don't think we need to get, really negative or worried. I think you just kind of keep your eye on the ball.
No, that makes sense to me. I don't think anyone needs to be panicking, but I do think it's something to be aware of, just to make sure, if you're going to have to motivate yourself to put in that little bit of extra effort, this would be a great time to do that.
I agree.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. With that, we are out of time. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, you can check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.